Okay, so let's get back to where we were previously. We were going to talk about gender roles in Islam. Now, this is an interesting subject and it's seen a lot of discussion, but there's some amount of misinformation about it. So let's think about it carefully. Um, in the Quran, there is a strong emphasis on the importance of respect for women. So women are not viewed as inferior in the Quran. Um, what the Quran does say is that men and women should have very different roles. So there's a strong emphasis on protecting and respecting women, but that there should be different social norms for men and different social norms for women. You might consider it a separate but equal type of thing. And in classic Arab culture, um, multiple wives were allowed for men. This is called polygyny, having multiple women as your wives. Um, now, this sometimes now we're used to cults and things like that that have a very negative way of doing that. But in some contexts, this could be more like a family cooperative, and that's what we see in some accounts from the ancient Arabs. That this was more of a communal thing. Now, could it be a place where men could abuse power? Definitely, but it could also be a place where the women who were wives of the same man saw themselves as sort of being partners and working together. Muhammad's first wife is actually a really respected figure in Islam. Khadija. She was the first convert to the religion, the first one to believe what he was saying. And he always in the Quran praised her very highly. She's called the mother of believers. And in ancient Arab society, it seems that women actually had a lot more opportunities than in some other societies, for instance, ancient Greece. While they weren't encouraged to be traveling a lot and to be interacting with men a lot, they could actually own property. They could own their own stuff and they could make financial deals. They could buy and sell, which is a pretty big deal compared to some ancient societies where women are not allowed to control their own lives. In Arab society, they were definitely able to control their own lives to some extent. Maybe not completely, but definitely had some tools at their disposal. Um, and so the most famous sort of thing in terms of gender roles is the idea of covering the head. And this likely actually dates back before Islam. It dates back to practices among the Arabs. And it may have some connections to Greek practices as well, with ideas of veils and things like that. But the odd thing is that in Islam, very frequently women who covered the head or covered the face in early times, they seemed to see it as a way of separating themselves out from men and not having to deal with men quite as much. That's one way it can be interpreted anyway. Um, and this may be kind of strange to us. But we see something kind of similar in Christianity with women proclaiming that they are going to be non-sexual, they are going to be chaste, which today seems to us like kind of a regressive thing. At the time, maybe seemed like an empowering thing in terms of, being separate from men and men not having as much power over them because they couldn't see their faces or because the women had officially taken a vow of chastity, as in Christianity. Now you have to be careful. There's room to interpret it both ways, as a negative thing, as a positive thing. But that might be part of the reason why someone might deliberately choose head covering. In any case, a lot of times it's often a particular part of one's culture, and that's something that a lot of people consider very important. Is to be connected to one's culture. So that's an aspect of it as well. But in general, a lot of ideas of gender roles in Islam, especially some of the ones that are more negative, actually come from the Hadith rather than the Quran. So how open-minded about women a particular Muslim country is going to depend a lot on the country and who's in charge. And another sign that things were actually kind of all right for women in ancient Arabia is that women could divorce. Um, and they could divorce if there was a bad marriage, if they were being abused, if they were being neglected, or if their husbands had gone bankrupt. So that's an interesting wrinkle. And that kind of suggests that a lot of the women's role in ancient Arab societies was on kind of a mercantile level, being connected to the caravans that were buying and selling gold and jewels and things like that, and incense across the desert, that women were involved in these important activities. And so that kind of gives us a sense of why Muhammad had such a good relationship with Khadija, and why he put so much emphasis on respect for women. So a lot to think about there, but hopefully that gives us some more ground to go on in terms of the way that Islam thinks about women. Turns out there's a lot of different interpretations, and there's just as much grounds for respecting women as for negative views. Now, I mentioned in Islamic art you have a reluctance to depict images in religious contexts. Now, again, this is going to vary a lot from place to place. But one response to that is just to avoid making images at all. So a lot of Muslim cultures have avoided images in their art. And so how does one make art without images? There's some pretty cool ways to do that. One of them is calligraphy, which is beautiful writing. The shaping of Arabic, and Arabic is a very flowy, intricate language, into these beautiful patterns. On top of that, you can have the use of patterns. Muslim art very frequently features tiles and patterns that are very intricately worked out with lots of neat detail and lots of lines. And this is what's known as an arabesque design, because invented by Arabic Muslims. But it's found in Muslim cultures around the world. Sometimes you can do cool tricks with calligraphy and make shapes out of them. This is a prayer of submission, I believe, and this is the holy prayers around the patterns in this part of a mosque here. So in religious context, especially, this is important, and outside of religious context, you might do it as well. But arabesques and calligraphy are important in the history of Islam. Now, here's an interesting thing, is that you could sometimes make images even of religious figures. Some Muslim cultures believed that, that you could make images of Muhammad and the other holy figures if you were writing about them as historical figures. If you were making like a depiction for a history book, not for a shrine that you would worship at. Sure, you wouldn't do that in a mosque, but you might do it in a history book. And so here is an example of that. This is from Rashid al-Din's History of the World, showing Muhammad as a figure and showing his armies and showing him with his followers. So that's interesting that it isn't quite what you would expect. Now, again, this differs a lot from place to place. In terms of architecture, we have the arabesques, and a very important thing in Muslim architecture is the minaret. So the minaret is part of a mosque, the mosque being the equivalent of a synagogue or a church. And the minaret is a tower that's part of the mosque that calls the faithful to the daily prayers. So if you think about, daily prayers as being something that brings all Muslims together, the minaret is a way to call everybody in town to go gather at the mosque to pray. That's one way of sort of unifying everybody. Another thing that could be is just a reminder to pray in your own home. In any case, you will hear the voice of a mullah, reading out the call to prayer, possibly in Arabic, or reading out prayers already from the Quran out to the whole city, the whole town. And today they have loudspeakers, so it really does project all the way through town. So that's a way of unifying everybody together, and we see that in the architecture. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about for architecture. Although there's one, I want to come back in a little bit to some of that. But I want to talk about the history of Islam and how it became so influential around the world. It spread through the Caliphates. So the Caliph is the religious leader of Islam and also the political leader of Islam, because we said those are often the same thing in Islam. Is basically the successor to Muhammad. Muhammad had an army, he had people who were his loyal followers, as at the same time as being the head of the religion. And that's what the Caliph is. So there are two significant caliphates that have a really big influence on medieval history, or history after the fall of Rome, I guess we could say. The first one is the Umayyad Caliphate, and they do something significant, which is they take over North Africa and Spain, as well as what we now today think of as the Middle East, but we could consider, Western Asia, the part including Iran and Iraq, or Persia and Mesopotamia over here, getting pretty close to the border with India. And this is going to have an effect on the way this part of the world is thought of. We think of Northern Africa as part of, quote, the Middle East, even though that term doesn't super make much sense in some ways, because, it's West over here. But this part of the world has a different religion from this part of the world. The northern part, which we think of as Europe, is more Christian. Africa and the east of Africa, or the western part of Asia, as well as Spain, are more Muslim. Then we have the Abbasid Caliphate, which controls more or less the same territory from the 700s to the 1200s, eventually loses Spain, and Spain gets taken over by Christians, becomes Catholic, but still having a Muslim influence in its background. And one of the really important things about the Caliphate is that we are used to thinking of there being tension between Muslims and Jews. That is not something that is true in this time period. That's not really true of the caliphates, nor is it true in this time period, at least, between Muslims and Christians. When the caliphs conquer, they do not try and get people to change their religion. What they do is they tax them. They tax Jews and Christians. Just a small tax to give them an incentive to convert. But it seems to have never been enough that people couldn't pay it if they had a little bit of financial resources. And in general, Muslims had a lot of respect for Jews and Christians. They are people of the book, people following that same Abrahamic tradition. And so Muslims, Christians, and Jews historically get along well. And that is something people don't realize. The current conflicts in the Middle East are very, very different from this time period. And in a lot of time periods, all these cultures have lived together very successfully and very happily as neighbors, basically. People project today's modern conflicts, which are about 50 or 60 years old. They project them backwards and say, oh, this has been happening for hundreds of years. It really hasn't. So this is something that fools people, trips them up all the time. But the idea of tension between the peoples of the book is a relatively modern concept. Now, later we do have the Crusades, which is going to be tension between Christians and Muslims, but we haven't gotten to there yet. We have to wait a few more centuries. Now, I want to talk about two branches of Islam, just kind of like we talked about two branches of Buddhism. So the two branches of Islam, you might have heard of them before. They are Sunni and Shia schools of Islam. And the Sunni could be described as the traditionalist school of Islam, although that would probably raise some argument from the Shia, who are the followers of Ali. So the division has to do with the succession after Muhammad. Who should have been the caliph? At a certain point, there was a dispute about this, and the succession, the Shia believe that the succession should have gone to Muhammad's heir, or believed heir, his son-in-law. They believe that he was the one appointed, and this message wasn't understood by everybody, and so Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, should have been the caliph. Whereas the Sunni school believes that the succession as established was legitimate, was righteously guided. Now you might wonder, why does this matter in terms of ideas? And I think it matters because um, this difference leads to different groups of Muslims not really connecting with each other. So over time, they build up different versions of Sharia. They build up different versions of Hadith. And so gradually over time, different ideas about how to live emerge from these two groups when they're separated. So even though it wasn't originally a conflict, it was originally a conflict over a very specific issue, it became two different cultures, effectively, two different ways of life. And for instance, the the Shia culture puts emphasis on the descendants of Ali. These are imams. They have a spiritual authority. They are people who should be the real caliphs and should be the real leaders of Islam, whereas the Sunni school doesn't recognize them. The Sunni, in terms of the demographics, the Sunni are about 80 to 90% of the Muslims around the world, whereas the Shia are 10 to 20% of Muslims around the world. Shia especially can be found in Iran and Iraq, which is why Americans starting wars in the Middle East heard quite a lot about them. But this is sort of the region of Shia Islam. In a lot of ways, Shia Islam is very connected to Persia and the sort of mountain separated off culture of Persia and the ideas that developed there. So there's some distinct differences in culture. But yeah, this is sort of these are the differences. And you might notice also that Islam is being practiced over here in Indonesia and places like that. And yeah, we don't think of that as being an East Asian thing, or Islam as being an East Asian thing, but it actually is. So this is a culture over here that mingles Buddhism and Islam, which is really interesting. Okay, and I want to mention one more group of Muslims. This isn't like a denomination per se, it's more like a movement. And this is what Westerners call Sufism. Sufis are mystics, basically. They are people who have, who really kind of separate off from the standard Muslim communities in certain ways and try to develop their own relationship to God. It's a sort of a movement among Muslims that focuses on a meditation, on prayer, on connecting to God, and following this sort of mystical experience of God. The word Sufi comes from wool wearers, meaning people who wear these scratchy shirts to sort of train themselves to be more disciplined and more devoted. Most common in the Sunni tradition, but I think there are some Shia Sufi figures who could be described as Sufi as well. I honestly feel like they have some sort of tendencies that are a lot like the Gnostics of Christianity and a lot like hippies. Whenever I see Muslims and hippies hanging out, it's usually Sufis. Because they are very mystical and they are very much about, you know, trying to understand the secrets of the universe through God and trying to understand God in one's own sort of mystical way. You may have heard of whirling dervishes. These are Sufi dancers who see dance as a spiritual way to connect with God. Dance is part of their prayer, and they have these traditional dances. And in general, Sufis place emphasis on the love of God, on this intense connection and maybe even a union with God. One of the most famous Sufis is a guy named Rumi. He was a Persian poet, and he spoke of his deep love of God. He wrote a ton of poems, and he wrote of seeing God as kind of this dear friend, this beloved person. And he could see God in the world, which is a contrast between Sufis and more sort of strict conservative Muslims who would say, you know, God is not the world, God is, you know, beyond the world. But Sufis say that God is in the world. Now, you don't worship the rock or the tree, but you worship God, and you can see that God is part of the rock or the tree, or the person that you meet, or the friend that you have. Rumi wrote quite a lot about his friend Shams, who he called beloved. May have literally been a lover. It's kind of hard to say for sure. But Shams was a dear friend and someone through whom he appreciated God. And then when he died, that added another wrinkle. So his poetry is all about sort of navigating this relationship with God. And he often calls God the friend or the beloved. And so his poems aren't afraid to use some sort of strange metaphors or even talk about sexuality as an image of God, that you find God in a lover's embrace, which is not maybe the most mainstream idea, right? Is something that some people are going to argue with, but it's certainly an interesting idea. One of his poems talks about Jesus. He says, Jesus was lost in his love for God. His donkey was drunk with barley. Drink from the presence of saints, not from other jars. Every object, every being is a jar full of delight. So, he's exploring all these images here. He's describing Jesus as someone who is drunk on God, and we too can learn to be drunk on God. There's some really good translations of Rumi's poems, and he's an interesting guy to check out. But I wanted to mention he's a good example of this kind of Sufi tradition. Okay, and one more thing I want to discuss is the role of knowledge in Islam. During the Abbasid Caliphate, we enter what's known as the Islamic Golden Age. This is a time period where, depending on who you ask, Europe may or may not be in decline, but certainly Europe is not part of the Roman Empire anymore during what's called the European Middle Ages. And so there's not as much communication, there's not as much trade, there's not as much writing and scholarship. They're not doing things like researching at the Library of Alexandria anymore. But in the Islamic world, they are doing things like that. And cities are booming and growing, and new cities are being founded, and there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of science and study and history and things like that. So this is this golden age from the 700s onward. In particular, the city of Baghdad in Iraq, or, to give it the most ancient term, Mesopotamia, the city of Baghdad is this center of scholarship and wisdom. A particular leader who we're going to get to later on establishes in Baghdad a house of wisdom, which is basically the Muslim equivalent of the Library of Alexandria. Their goal is to translate all the world's knowledge into Arabic. And Muslim scholars do play a role in helping preserve Greek and Roman knowledge after the fall of Rome. They had a little bit of help from people in places like Byzantium, which was still influenced by Greek culture. But they also continued this idea of scholarship, tried to develop knowledge and science further. For instance, there were new discoveries in astronomy and mathematics, medicine, chemistry, geography, philosophy, history. There was a guy named Ibn Khaldun who comes up sometimes in the study of history because he had a theory about empires. He believed that an empire has a sort of unifying idea, what he called its spirit, that basically makes it function. And so maybe for Rome, we kind of talked about this before at one point, maybe for Rome, the unifying idea was its military strategy that it was using. And when that idea was lost, that's when Rome began to fall apart. That's the sort of thing that Ibn Khaldun would have been aware of. And so in his text, he's developing like this political theory, basically, in his analysis of history. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on in Baghdad. Some other really important cities are Cairo and Cordoba. And if we look at the map here, I'll just point to where they are. So Cordoba is over here in Spain. Baghdad is I went too far, is over here in Iraq. And then Cairo is the new city in Egypt that is sort of the center of Muslim presence in Egypt. And in these cities, we see great developments in knowledge and in art and architecture. Here's an example of a advancement in astronomy from the House of Wisdom, is the studying of eclipses and of the lunar phases, and figuring out exactly how they work with mathematical precision that the Greeks weren't able to do, and coming up with a clear explanation for why eclipses happen. That was part of the kind of scholarship that was going on. And I want to close with just showing you one more example of Islamic art, which is the Mosque of Cordoba, which is something that's still around today and is very cool. Uses these recurring columns, but with a very different column style than we saw with like the Greeks or Romans. Also, this striped pattern here, that's something that we very rarely see, or we didn't see up until this point. And so this is becomes one of the hallmarks of Spanish and kind of in general Muslim architecture. In Istanbul, there's mosques with similar designs to them. And I love that they use in the Mosque of Cordoba these recurring columns. So this forest of columns, you can see how big they are by these tiny people down here. And you would have looked at this forest of columns and just seen how it kind of goes on forever. This is very similar to what the Persian king did back in his palace at Persepolis hundreds and hundreds of years before this. And if you look at it from the outside, you can see this courtyard. Here's the minaret that calls people to prayer. And here is the whole forest of columns are underneath here as part of the building. So just an example of the kind of impressive stuff that Muslim architecture gets up to. So yeah, just a sense of how these themes and ideas develop. So we've kind of jumped around in time a fair bit. We've kind of gone ahead a fair ways because we're talking about some later stuff, but hopefully this gives you guys a sense of the importance of Islam in world history and the Islamic world. So I am going to have a quiz on this one, like I did with Buddhism. So I didn't have the quiz on the quiz on Christianity because I'm saving that those topics for when we discuss the Middle Ages. But I am going to do a quiz on Islam, so I'll look for that. And yeah, it should be basically just be based on stuff that we talked about today. And I will see you guys in the discussion question for a discussion of the success of Islam. So I will see you guys there. Take care.